Welcome back to the Digital Portrait Drawing course. We are in Lesson 12. In this lesson, I'm titling Facial Differences for Male and Female. So we'll take a look at the differences between men and women when it comes to creating portraits. So before we begin, I'd like to go ahead and point out that there are a lot of differences that are really more social than they are physical, more expectation than they are anything else. And not that those are necessarily bad, but they do create easy ways for you to create differences between the men and women. Clearly, if you're portraying a face that has jewelry and makeup on it, most likely it's going to be a woman. And if you have a face that has facial hair, so if there's a beard, then that's clearly going to be a man. There's also other things that we can use to help designate between the two. And some are physical, and some are more socially expected. And we'll deal with both of those. So first, let's start with these two faces. Now, they're just two faces. There's no other differentiating things that would clearly show one gender between the other, things like hairstyle or earrings or things like that that might help us show it, but I think it's pretty clear that one of the faces is masculine and the other one's feminine. And so the discussion for today is, why do they look that way? What is it about these two faces that makes them look like they belong to a particular gender? And how do we use that to our advantage? Well, I hope you can agree with me that the face on the left appears masculine and the face on the right appears feminine. So let's talk about the differences that we see between these two. Now, right away, you can see that the masculine face is darker and more angular. The lines are harder and sharper. That is more of a social expectation, because we do expect males to appear more rugged, and we expect females to appear more beautiful, softer, more delicate in their features and in the shading as well. Now, there is some physical truth to that. Women's faces generally do appear smoother than a man's face does, not only because of the lack of facial hair, but just because the way the skin and the other tissue lies over the bone, it creates a smoother surface than it does for the man. That's in general. Now, there are exceptions to these rules. There always are. People are all different shapes and sizes, but when we're talking about developing portraits and you want your figure to look manly, or you want your figure to look womanly, these are things to take into account. The man's face is going to have more angular shadows. The woman's face is going to have softer shadows. So we should see more contrast and higher shadow areas in the masculine face. In fact, that's one of the things that you can do almost immediately if you're struggling to make your man's face look masculine, is deepen the shadows. Just go ahead and increase that contrast, and that may put it over the edge for what you're drawing. All right, now at this point, I'm going to overlay these two faces, but so that we can easily tell the difference between them, I'm going to colorize them first. Okay, so now let's overlay these two faces. And we'll adjust the opacity as we need to, just so we can talk about one or the other. If you see a difference here, a woman's face is generally more rounded as well. If you look at the outline there, I know it looks a little weird without the ears added to it, but the man's face will generally be more narrow and more angular, where the woman's face will be a little bit wider and rounder, especially near the chin. Okay, a man's face, usually you want to put in a nice block chin to it, so really chisel those angles out of there, whereas with a woman's face, you want it to be softer and more rounded, have more of a curve to it. Now, the number one difference you can expect to see as far as details go is eyelashes. And that's not a surprise. A man's eyelashes are present, but they're not nearly as noticeable as the woman's eyelash. And that's more of a social thing. Women don't normally have extremely longer eyelashes. That's a difference that's exaggerated in artwork because it's an easy difference to put between the two. You'll even see this in highly stylized cartoons where the only difference between two characters is one has eyelashes and the other doesn't, and you know that the one with eyelashes is the female. But there is one difference that is more physical, that is much more important as far as realism goes. That is, in the man's face, there is a structural difference to the skull. The bone that is above the eye, just right here in the cranium, is actually thicker. You could say that men are more bone-headed than women, and that's technically true. But what that does is that thicker bone over on top of the eyes, it makes the eyebrows appear closer to the eyes. Now, in a profile, it'll mean that that bump along the brow is more extended, that it's more noticeable on a man than it is with a woman. But for the front view and the three-quarter view, what that mostly means is the foreshortening of it creates the eyebrows closer to the eyes. Sometimes they even touch as far as the drawing is concerned, where the woman has much more space there. There's more clear area between the eyes and the eyebrows. Also, a woman's eyebrows are normally more meticulously plucked and groomed, and they're smaller and they're very intentional about where they are, where a man's eyebrows are just a mess. In fact, if you want to make things look even more masculine but not really handsome, go ahead and give them a unibrow. And that's another telltale sign of masculinity. So, the eyes themselves do have some differences. So, a woman's eyes will tend to look, they're more open. You should be able to see more openness to them. And the eyelashes themselves do tend to create the illusion of a larger eye. And a man's eye will tend to be more squinted, and it'll tend to have more wrinkles and crevices around it as well to give them more of a rugged look to it. Now, the overall features of the face will be a little more compressed with a woman. That's why the noses and the lips aren't quite lining up here. The man's face is going to be slightly larger because the head is slightly larger. So that's why these aren't exactly lined up. Okay, let's move on to look at the noses. You don't want to make a woman's nose look large. You want it to be just indicated. You want it to use soft lines and just sort of have it blend in, and you want it to look petite. You want it to look small and almost delicate. And that's one of those social norms of a woman's face appearing more beautiful, because the nose is smaller and delicate and just overall more dainty than a man's big honking nose. A man's nose does tend to dominate the center of his face. You can draw the nostrils in really large for a man, and it doesn't really matter because it does just give a more of a presence to a man's face, is having this large nose on it. The men aren't quite as concerned with how that looks in the middle of their face like that as you need to be with a woman's face. Okay, and then the lips. A woman's lips should be almost the crown jewel of the lower portion of her face. They need to be full, they need to look luscious and wet and almost kissable, so to say, almost inviting in that sense. So they will have a much thicker bottom lip here, but the overall mouth is a little bit smaller, so it's a little bit more narrow together. I know before we talked about dropping down the straight lines right from the pupils. That still should hold true, but you can smoosh it in just a little bit to create a more feminine and a more delicate appearance. And you definitely want to make sure you get the highlights in there so they look nice and wet and very inviting in that sense. Where a man's mouth, primarily, the important thing to focus on is this shadow underneath the bottom lip, going into the cleft chin. Even if the man doesn't have a cleft chin, put this shadow underneath here. It indicates a more masculine look. The mouth is a little bit wider, and the top lip is a lot more narrow. And if you can put some facial hair around it, that will obviously make it appear more manly. But even if the man doesn't have facial hair, you use some shading to sort of indicate where that goes. And it's accepted as shadow and shading of the skin and not actually hair, and does add to the more masculine feature. And then the last thing to mention is the actual shadowing or the shading on the faces. Now, we talked before about the bones of a man's skull being thicker. That doesn't hold true only for the brow line. It's also on the bones that are underneath the eyes and form these cheek pockets here. And due to the thicker layer of bone in the head, the skin will lie a little bit tighter to the bone and create more shadows. That's really the anatomy behind the idea that a man's face has more shadows and shading to it than a woman's face does. There is some truth to that, but we've taken that little kernel of truth and sort of exaggerated upon it, and usually tend to make a woman's face appear as smooth as porcelain and a man's face more rugged, almost as if it's carved from a piece of granite. Those are several different ways that you can use in different techniques for showing the difference between a man's face and a woman's face without resorting to other common things like mustaches or earrings and hairstyle. So that's it for lesson 12. Thanks for joining me. Now we know the facial differences for males and females when it comes to drawing portraits. And next, we'll move on to some fun stuff. We will attempt to create a color illustration from one of our previous portraits.